A man was executed by the most powerful empire on earth. Not imprisoned, not exiled, executed, publicly, on a hill outside a city that most Romans had barely heard of, in the most humiliating way the empire knew how, designed specifically to send a message to anyone watching. This is what happens to people who challenge Rome. Within 300 years, that empire had converted to his religion. Let that land for a moment. The empire that killed him became officially Christian. The emperor who once persecuted Christians was replaced by an emperor who built churches. The symbol of his execution, the cross, went from being the most feared symbol of Roman power to being carried on Roman shields. How? How does that happen? How does a man executed as a criminal in a minor province of the world's greatest empire end up 3 centuries later being worshipped by that same empire? That is the question we are going to follow tonight. And it all started with a teenage girl in a village nobody had heard of, saying yes to an angel who told her she was going to have a baby without a father while still a virgin, and that baby was going to change everything. Before we get into it, go ahead and like the video, hit subscribe if this is the kind of thing you enjoy, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. And while you're at it, tell me whether you're watching as a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere beautifully in between. I read every single one, and I am always genuinely moved by who shows up for these videos at this hour. Now, find a comfortable position, because where we're going tonight is a long way from here. 2,000 years, a small country, an empire that no longer exists, a language almost nobody speaks anymore, and a story that somehow is still the most alive thing in the room. I want to tell you something before we begin. This video is not a sermon. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am not here to convert you. I am not here to argue theology or doctrine or which version of the story is correct. I am here to tell you a story, the one that has been told for 2,000 years in every language on earth, in cathedrals and mud huts and prison cells and hospital rooms, to children falling asleep, to soldiers before battles, to people in the last hours of their lives who needed to hear it one more time. Whether you believe every word, some words, or none of the words, I think you will find that this story does something to you, that it has a weight, gravity, the way only certain stories do, stories that carry, inside them, something true about what it means to be human. So, let's begin. To understand this story, you have to understand the world it was born into. Not the paintings, not the stained glass, not the 2,000 years of art, music and theology that came after. The actual world. The one he woke up in every morning. The one his mother cooked in. The one his father worked in. The one his neighbours argued in and prayed in and paid in taxes and quietly, desperately hopes would someday be different. Because the world he was born into was a world under occupation, and that changes everything about the story. Rome. In 4 BC, the Roman Empire was the most powerful civilization on earth. It stretched from the cold forests of Britain to the hot sands of North Africa, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the edge of Mesopotamia. An empire of 50 million people governed from one city by one man through an administrative system so efficient, so ruthless, so thoroughly organized that it is still studied 2,000 years later by people trying to understand how power works. And Judea, the small strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, was a province of that empire. Not a willing province, not a grateful one. A province that had been, for generations, praying for the day when the occupation would end. The Jewish people. Let's spend time here, because you cannot understand what Jesus meant to the people who heard him without understanding who the Jewish people were and what they were waiting for. The Jews of the first century were a people with an extraordinary history. A history of covenant, of promise, of a relationship with God that went back to Abraham 4,000 years before. A history of slavery in Egypt and liberation through Moses. A history of kings, David and Solomon, and the Golden Age that represented those names. A history of exile in Babylon and return. And now, this. Roman soldiers on their streets, Roman taxes on their income, Roman law over their lives. A people who believed with complete certainty that they were God's chosen people, living under the boot of the most powerful pagan empire in the world. The Messiah. This word is at the center of everything. Mashiach in Hebrew, the Anointed One, the one who was coming, the one the prophets had spoken of for centuries, in language so vivid, so specific, that the Jewish people of the first century knew exactly what they were looking for. A king, a descendant of David, someone who would come and restore the kingdom, drive out the Romans, establish justice, bring the age of peace that the prophets called the kingdom of God. They had been waiting for a very long time. Generation after generation, looking at their children, wondering whether this generation would be the one that finally saw it. The hope passed down like a lamp from hand to hand through the centuries, kept burning through everything that had tried to extinguish it. The temple. Because the temple was the heart of everything. In Jerusalem, on a hill, the temple of God. Not the first temple, Solomon's temple, that had been destroyed by the Babylonians 6 centuries before. The second temple, rebuilt, expanded by Herod the Great into something so magnificent, so vast, that visitors from across the Roman Empire came specifically to see it. The Roman historian Pliny called it the most famous place in the entire East. Its walls 30 meters high, its stones, some of them weighing 500 tons, its courtyards capable of holding hundreds of thousands of pilgrims at the great festivals, and at its centre, the Holy of Holies, the innermost chamber, where, in the theology of the Jewish people, the presence of God dwelt, entered by the high priest alone, once a year, on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the most sacred space in the most sacred city in the world. Herod the Great. Let's meet him, because he was still ruling when this story began. Herod appointed by Rome to govern Judea on their behalf. A complicated man, a builder of extraordinary things. The temple, the harbour at Caesarea, the fortress of Masada, perched on a cliff above the Dead Sea, still standing today, still extraordinary, 2,000 years later. And a man of deep, corrosive fear, afraid, above all things, of losing his throne. So afraid that he had members of his own family killed when he suspected they might replace him. The Emperor Augustus famously remarked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. This was the man who was on the throne when the wise men arrived from the east, asking about a newborn king. You can imagine how well that went. The ordinary people. Let's come down from the palace, from the temple, from the halls of power, and go to where most people actually lived. The villages, scattered across the hills of Galilee in the north, and Judea in the south. Small, dusty, entirely unremarkable to anyone passing through. Houses of mud brick or local stone, 1 or 2 rooms, the family and the animals sharing space in the winter, the warmth of the animals keeping everyone alive. The diet, bread, olive oil, fish from the lake if you lived near Galilee, lentils, vegetables, wine diluted with water. Simple food, good food, the food of people who worked hard with their hands and sat together at the end of the day, grateful for what they had. The taxes. Because the Roman occupation was not just soldiers on the street. It was, in the most direct and personal way, money. The Jewish people paid taxes to Rome. They paid taxes to Herod. They paid taxes to the temple. Layer upon layer of obligation extracted from people who were already living simply. The tax collectors, called publicans, were Jews themselves who collected on behalf of Rome, taking their percentage in the process, which made them, in the eyes of their neighbours, collaborators, traitors, the most despised people in Jewish society, which is worth remembering when we get to the moment where Jesus chose one of them as a disciple, not a priest, not a scholar, a tax collector, the person that everyone else had already decided was beyond redemption. The religious landscape. Because first century Judaism was not a single thing. The Pharisees, the most influential religious group among ordinary people, deeply serious about the law, about the 613 commandments that the Torah contained, and their interpretation and their application to every aspect of daily life. Not villains, the way they are sometimes portrayed. People who genuinely believed that faithfulness to the law was the way to bring the Messiah and the kingdom of God. The Sadducees, the priestly class, the establishment, the people who ran the temple, who cooperated carefully with Rome, because cooperation kept the temple open, kept the worship going, kept the fragile peace intact. And the zealots, the ones who believed that the kingdom of God would only come through armed resistance, through fighting, through driving the Romans out by force. A world full of competing visions of what salvation looked like and how to get there, into which a carpenter's son from Nazareth was about to walk and say something that none of them were expecting. The lake. Let's end here, in Galilee, in the north, where he grew up, where most of the story happened. The Sea of Galilee, not really a sea, a lake, 13 miles long, 8 miles wide, ringed by hills, fed by the Jordan River, full of fish, tilapia and carp and sardines, that the fishermen of its shores had been pulling from the water since before memory. The light on the lake, in the early morning, before the fishermen came in, was, by every account, extraordinary. Pink and gold, reflected in still water, the hills on the eastern shore catching the first sun. A beautiful place, an ordinary place. The place where the most extraordinary story in human history chose to begin. Not in Rome, not in Jerusalem, on a lake, in the north, where fishermen were already awake, pulling nets before the world had any idea what was coming. Let the lake settle into morning, the light coming up over the eastern hills, the fishermen pulling in their nets, not yet knowing that one morning, not long from now, a man would walk along this shore and their lives would never be the same again. Chapter 2 is waiting. The birth. The announcement to a young woman in Nazareth that changed everything. The journey to Bethlehem. The barn. The shepherds who were the first people in the world to hear the news. Not kings, not priests. Shepherds, out in the fields, at night. Which, if you think about it, tells you almost everything you need to know about this story. But only when you need it. The lake is still. The light is coming up. The fishermen are working. Everything is about to change. She was probably 14, maybe 15. Young by our standards. Not unusual by the standards of first century Judea, where girls married young, where life was shorter, where the rhythms of life moved differently than they do now. Her name was Miriam. We know her as Mary. She lived in Nazareth, a village so small, so unremarkable, that it doesn't appear in any Roman record, in any Jewish record outside the Gospels. A village in Palestine that nobody had ever heard of, which is exactly the kind of place this story kept choosing. The moment that the Gospel of Luke describes with such careful, such extraordinary attention. The angel Gabriel appearing to Mary, not in a dream, not in a vision, present, in the room. And the first thing Gabriel said was, "Do not be afraid," which tells you everything about what Mary's face must have looked like in that moment. The message delivered simply. You will conceive and give birth to a son. You will call him Jesus. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. His kingdom will never end. And Mary, 14 years old, in a small village that nobody had heard of, asked the most practical question imaginable. How will this happen, since I am not married? And then, her answer. After the explanation, after Gabriel told her that nothing was impossible with God, after she had a moment to absorb what was being asked of her. I am the Lord's servant. Let it be, as you have said. 5 words, In the Greek of the Gospel, 5 words that changed the world. Not reluctantly, not with conditions, not, "Can I have some time to think about it?" Yes, completely, immediately. And I want you to think about what that yes actually meant. For a 14-year-old girl in 1st century Judea, an unmarried woman found to be with child faced real consequences. Social consequences from her community, from her family, from Joseph, the man she was engaged to, who had not yet been told anything. She said yes, knowing all of that, or perhaps not fully knowing and saying yes anyway, which, if anything, is more remarkable. Joseph. Let's spend time with him, because Joseph, in the telling of this story, is often quietly overlooked. He was a carpenter, a craftsman, a working man in Nazareth, engaged to Mary, planning, as engaged men plan, a future, a house, a family, the ordinary good life of an ordinary good man. And then Mary told him. The Gospel of Matthew tells us that Joseph was a righteous man, and that, not wanting to expose Mary to public shame, he decided to end the engagement quietly, privately, protecting her even in his hurt, even in his confusion, even in the moment when he had every reason to be angry. A righteous man, quietly protecting someone who had just turned his world completely around. The dream. That night, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. What is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son. You shall call him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And Joseph, when he woke, did what the angel had told him. He took Mary as his wife, without fanfare, without record of argument or negotiation or extended deliberation. He simply did what needed doing. The quiet man making the quiet decision that allowed everything else to happen. We don't have a single word attributed to Joseph in any of the Gospels. Not one. He is present throughout the early story, but always silent. Doing, protecting, providing. The Father who said nothing and did everything. The census. The reason for the journey. The reason that a heavily pregnant woman was on a road 100 kilometers from home. Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor, had decreed that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Everyone was to return to their ancestral hometown to be registered. Joseph, being of the line of David, had to travel to Bethlehem, David's city, 6 miles south of Jerusalem, 100 kilometers from Nazareth. The journey, by foot and by donkey, would have taken approximately 4 or 5 days. Through the hill country, through the heat, through the particular discomfort of travelling when you are very close to giving birth. A journey that no one would have chosen for a woman in Mary's condition. But Caesar Augustus had decreed a census, and Caesar Augustus did not make exceptions for young women from small villages in Galilee who were expecting. Bethlehem. They arrived, tired. Joseph, looking for somewhere to stay. The Gospel of Luke says simply, there was no room in the inn. 5 words that have echoed through 2,000 years of Christian thought. No room for the child who would claim to be the light of the world. No room for the birth that half the world would one day celebrate. No room in the inn. What they were offered instead was a place with the animals, a stable or a cave. Scholars still debate which, but the point is the same. Not a room, not a bed, not the comfort that a woman in labour deserves. A place where animals slept, where the smell was animal, where the floor was not swept, where the only warmth came from the bodies of creatures who had no idea what was happening in the straw beside them. The birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in cloths, and laid him in a manger. A manger, a feeding trough. The place where the animals ate was the first bed of the child that 2 billion people would one day call the Son of God. Mary, 14 years old, in a stable, far from home, having just travelled 100 kilometres, wrapping her newborn son in whatever cloth she had brought, and laying him in the only thing that was available. Doing what mothers do, in every circumstance, in every century, making the best of what they have, making it, somehow, enough. The shepherds, out in the fields that same night, keeping watch over their flocks. Not the most respected profession in first century Judea. Shepherds, by the nature of their work, lived outside the rhythms of religious life, couldn't always observe the Sabbath, couldn't always make it to the temple. Considered by some religious authorities of the time as people on the margins. And yet, they were the very first people in the world to be told that the Messiah had arrived. Not Herod, not the high priest, not the Roman governor. Shepherds, in a field, at night. An angel appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were, the Gospel says, terrified, which seems entirely reasonable. Do not be afraid. Again, those words, do not be afraid. I bring you good news that will cause great joy for all the people. Today, in the town of David, a Saviour has been born to you. He is the Messiah, the Lord. This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in cloths and lying in a manger. A manger. That was the sign. Not a palace, not a throne room, not the temple. A manger. Go look for a baby in a feeding trough, and you will have found the one you have been waiting for. And then, suddenly, a great company of angels appearing, praising God, saying, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to those on whom his favour rests." And the shepherds said to one another, "Let's go to Bethlehem and see this thing that has happened." Let's go and see. 5 words, as important in their own way as Mary's 5 words. The first act of faith in the story of Jesus. Not a theological argument, not a carefully reasoned position. Just, let's go and see. They went. They found Mary and Joseph and the baby lying in the manger. And when they had seen him, they spread the word concerning what had been told them about this child. The first evangelists, shepherds, smelling of sheep, telling everyone they met what they had seen. The Magi, the wise men, the ones the paintings always show, riding camels, following a star, arriving at the stable on the same night as the shepherds. The Gospel of Matthew tells their story, and Matthew, notably, does not say there were 3 of them. The tradition of 3 comes from the 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, myrrh. There could have been 2, there could have been 12. Matthew simply says, Magi from the east. Scholars debate who they were. Astronomers, probably. From Persia or Babylon or Arabia. Men who studied the stars and had seen something in the night sky that told them something extraordinary had happened in Judea. And they had come a very long way to find it. They came first to Jerusalem, to Herod's palace. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. And Herod, hearing this, was disturbed. The Gospel says, and all Jerusalem with him, which, if you remember what we know about Herod, makes complete sense. A man who had killed members of his own family to protect his throne was now being told that a new king had just been born. He called the chief priests, he called the teachers of the law. Where is the Messiah to be born? In Bethlehem, they told him. The prophet Micah had said so centuries before. Herod sent the Magi to Bethlehem. Find the child, he said, and when you have found him, report back to me, so that I too may go and worship him. He had no intention of worshipping anyone. The Magi, being wise, understood this. And after they had found the child and presented their gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh, they went home by a different route, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod. And Joseph, also warned in a dream, took Mary and the child and fled to Egypt. The child, not yet a year old probably, already a refugee, already displaced, already the kind of person that the world was trying to make room for in one of the most ancient ways there is. Born in a barn. First visitors, shepherds. First home after Egypt. The world already trying to find somewhere for him. He was just beginning. Let the road settle into night. Mary holding the child on the journey south. Joseph walking beside them, silent as he always was, doing what needed doing. The stars above, the same stars the Magi had followed, still there, still burning, indifferent and beautiful. Chapter 3 is waiting. The boy. 30 years, almost, that we know almost nothing about. The childhood in Nazareth, the carpenter's workshop, the one story that survived from all those years. One story. And it tells you almost everything you need to know about who he was going to become. But only when you need it. The road is quiet. The child is sleeping. The stars are out. We know almost nothing about 30 years of his life. 30 years out of 33. 9/10 of the entire life of the most written about person in human history, and we have almost nothing. A few details. He grew up in Nazareth. His father was a carpenter, or perhaps a stonemason, the Greek word tekton covering both. He had brothers and sisters. He learned to read, which was not universal in 1st century Judea, but was common among Jewish boys who were taught the Torah from childhood. He spoke Aramaic, the everyday language of Galilee. He knew Hebrew, the language of the scriptures. He may have known some Greek, the language of commerce, in a region that was part of the Roman Empire. And that is almost everything we know for certain about the first 30 years. But there is one story, one single story from his childhood that survived, and it is worth everything. He was 12 years old. The family had travelled to Jerusalem for the Passover festival, the great annual pilgrimage when Jewish families from across Judea and Galilee made the journey to the temple, to remember the exodus from Egypt, to offer sacrifice, to be together as a people in the most sacred city in the world. The family went every year. This year, something was different. After the festival, the family began the journey home, travelling as families did in a large group. Friends and relatives all heading north together, the safety and companionship of the caravan. A day into the journey, Mary and Joseph realised that Jesus was not with them. They had assumed, naturally, that he was somewhere in the group. With relatives, perhaps, with friends his own age. Children in a travelling group moved freely between families. It was not unusual not to see him for hours, but a whole day had passed, and he was not there. They went back to Jerusalem. 3 days they searched. 3 days. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 3 days of a parent looking for a lost child in a city the size of Jerusalem during the Passover festival, when hundreds of thousands of people were passing through. 3 days of the particular fear that only a parent knows when a child cannot be found. And then they found him, in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions. And everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. Mary's response. When his parents saw him, they were astonished, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been searching for you anxiously." Which is possibly the most relatable thing anyone says in the entire gospel. 3 days of searching, the relief of finding him, and then the very human, very parental, "Why would you do this to us?" And Jesus, 12 years old, looked at his mother and said, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I had to be in my Father's house?" The first recorded words of Jesus in any gospel. A 12-year-old to his worried mother in the temple in Jerusalem. And the gospel says that they did not understand what he was saying to them. Mary and Joseph, who had been told by angels what this child was, still did not fully understand. Which is one of the most honest things in the entire story. Knowing something and understanding it are not the same thing. You can be told the most extraordinary news and still, standing in the temple, looking at your 12-year-old son, not quite grasp what it means. Mary, the Gospel tells us, treasured all these things in her heart. She didn't understand. She held it, the way you hold something too large to carry, but too important to put down. And then he went home, back to Nazareth, with his parents. And the Gospel says he was obedient to them. He went back to the carpenter's workshop, back to the bench, back to the wood and the tools, and the ordinary apprenticeship of a craftsman's son in a small Galilean village. For another 18 years. approximately. Working, growing, becoming whatever it is that 30 years of ordinary life makes a person. The hidden years. This is what theologians call them. The hidden years. The 30 years before the ministry began that left almost no trace in any historical record. What do we do with this silence? Some traditions have tried to fill it. Stories of the young Jesus travelling to India, to Egypt, to Britain in one tradition, learning from philosophers and mystics across the ancient world. These stories have no historical basis, but they tell you something about how uncomfortable the silence makes people. How much we want to know what happened in those 30 years. What shaped him? What formed him? What turned the 12-year-old asking questions in the temple into the man who stood in the Jordan River and changed everything? What we can imagine, because imagination, guided by what we know, is not the same as invention. He worked with his hands. Wood, stone, the materials of the craftsman, the particular knowledge that comes from making things, from understanding how things are built and how they fail and what holds them together. He would have known from years of building what Jesus later said about building on rock and building on sand. Not metaphor, born from reading. Metaphor, born from experience. From watching what happened to foundations when the rain came and the floods rose and the wind blew. He would have known the scriptures deeply. The Torah, read every Sabbath in the synagogue. The Psalms, sung so many times that they would have lived in his body, the way songs live when you have sung them your whole life. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, whose words he would later quote with the ease of someone who had been living with them for decades. He would have known grief. Joseph, his earthly father, disappears from the story before the ministry begins. Scholars believe he died during the hidden years, which means Jesus, at some point, became the eldest son of a widow, with younger brothers and sisters to help provide for. The craftsman, working not just for himself, but for his family. Knowing, before he ever taught about it, what it meant to give what you had for the people you loved. The village. Nazareth, in the 1st century, was a village of perhaps 400 people. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone knew whose son you were. Everyone knew what your family was like, what your father had done, what your mother was known for. The village, both shelter and constraint. The place that knew you completely, and sometimes, because of that, could not quite see you clearly. We will see this later in the story, when Jesus returned to Nazareth to teach, and was met not with wonder, but with skepticism. Is this not the carpenter's son? Do we not know his mother, his brothers, his sisters? The village that had watched him grow, unable to see past what it already knew. The waiting, because there is something extraordinary about the hidden years that we don't talk about enough. He waited. Whatever he knew or sensed or understood about who he was and what he was here to do. He waited 30 years before he began. Working, providing, living the ordinary life of an ordinary man in an ordinary village that nobody had heard of. There is something deeply human in that waiting. The knowledge that something is coming, that something is building, that something cannot be rushed, no matter how much part of you wants to begin. The willingness to stay where you are until the moment is right, until the time has come. And then, one day, he heard about a man in the wilderness near the Jordan River. A man who was drawing enormous crowds. A man who was saying that the kingdom of God was near. A man who was calling people to prepare. His name was John, and he was, as it happened, a relative. The hidden years were over. The time had come. The carpenter set down his tools for the last time and walked toward the river. 30 years of ordinary life. And then the walk toward the water. Everything about to begin. Let the workshop settle into quiet. The tools on the bench. The wood shavings on the floor. The ordinary space that held 30 years of extraordinary waiting. Chapter 4 is waiting, the baptism, and the wilderness. John the Baptist in the desert, drawing crowds with a message that nobody could quite ignore. The moment in the Jordan River that marked the beginning of everything. And then 40 days alone in the desert, with nothing, facing something, coming back different, but only when you need it. The workshop is quiet, the tools are resting, the road is just beginning. Why would the Son of God need to be baptized? Baptism was for sinners, for people who needed to repent, for people who needed to begin again. So why did the man that 2 billion people believe was without sin stand in a river and ask his cousin to baptize him? Even John, the one doing the baptizing, asked the same question. "I need to be baptized by you," John said, "and you are coming to me?" The answer Jesus gave is one of the most quietly profound things he ever said, and it tells you exactly what kind of Messiah he had decided to be. John the Baptist. Let's meet him properly, because John is one of the most extraordinary figures in this entire story. He lived in the wilderness, the Judean desert east of Jerusalem, one of the harshest, most unforgiving landscapes in the world. He wore clothing made of camel's hair with a leather belt. He ate locusts and wild honey, which is the ancient equivalent of saying this man lived as far outside conventional society as it was possible to live and still technically be in it. And yet, people came to him in enormous numbers, from Jerusalem, from all of Judea, from the whole region of the Jordan. They came into the desert to hear this man who lived on locusts and honey and wore camel hair and said things that nobody else was saying. What John said, his message was not comfortable. Repent, turn around, change direction. The kingdom of heaven is near. And the people who came to him heard this, and something in them responded. Something that recognized that this was true, that a turning was needed, that the direction they had been walking was not quite right, that something was coming and they needed to be ready for it. He baptized them in the Jordan River, a ritual washing, going into the water representing the old life, coming out of the water representing the new one. The ancient river of the Exodus, of the crossing into the promised land, now the river of a different kind of beginning. And then Jesus arrived, from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. John, when he saw him, tried to stop him. "I need to be baptized by you," John said, "and you are coming to me." The man who had been calling people to prepare, suddenly face to face with the one they were preparing for. And his first instinct was to step back, to defer. "I am not worthy to untie the sandals of this man." The greatest compliment one teacher could pay another in the first century was to carry their sandals. John said, "I am not even worthy to do that." "Let it be so now," Jesus said. "It is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." And John agreed and baptized him. And Jesus came up out of the water. And at that moment the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." The beginning, the public beginning, the moment that the hidden years had been moving toward for 30 years. The dove, the voice, the river, and a man standing in the water, receiving what had always been his. And then, immediately, the Spirit led him into the wilderness, not into a town, not to begin teaching, not to gather disciples, or announce himself, or do any of the things you might expect after the most extraordinary moment of your life. Into the wilderness, alone, for 40 days and 40 nights. 40, a significant number in the Jewish tradition. 40 years in the desert for Moses and the people. 40 days of rain for Noah. 40, the number of testing, of trial, of preparation. And here, 40 days, alone, in the harshest landscape, in the region with nothing to eat and something to face. The temptation. The Gospels tell us that during those 40 days he was tempted by the devil. I want to be careful and honest about how I tell this part. For those who believe this was a real encounter with a real spiritual adversary. For those who understand it differently, it is, at the very least, a profound account of a human being facing with complete honesty the deepest questions about power, about purpose, about what it means to be who you are. Either way, what happened in the wilderness was real, and it matters. The first temptation. After 40 days of fasting, he was hungry. The tempter said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." A practical suggestion. He was hungry. He had the ability, apparently, to do this. Why not? And the answer he gave reveals everything about what he understood, his power to be for. Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. The power was not for himself. The hunger was not the point. The answer, a refusal to use what he had for his own comfort. The first test of what kind of Messiah he was going to be. The second temptation. He was taken to the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and they will lift you up." A different kind of test. Not comfort. Spectacle. Prove yourself. Do something dramatic, undeniable, that will make everyone believe immediately, without question. And the answer, again, was a refusal. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. The kingdom he was building would not be built on spectacle, on the compulsion of the crowd, on the overwhelming, undeniable miracle that left no room for choice. It would be built on something quieter, on invitation, on the still small voice that required a listening heart to hear. The third temptation, the most revealing of all. He was shown all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour. All this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. Power, complete power over everything. The Roman Empire, the kingdoms of the East, all of it offered in exchange for one act of submission. And the answer, the final answer, was the clearest of all. Away from me. Worship the Lord your God, and serve him only. The kingdom he had come to establish would not be achieved through the methods of earthly kingdoms, not through power over others, not through dominance, not through the accumulation of what the world considered valuable. 3 temptations, 3 refusals, 3 definitions of what this Messiah was and was not going to be. And then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. The 40 days over, the testing complete, the questions answered, at least for now, in the silence of the desert, before a single crowd had gathered, before a single word had been spoken in public. He came back from the wilderness to Galilee. Different, in the way that facing something difficult and coming through it makes a person different. Clearer, more settled, knowing with a certainty that the desert had tested and found solid exactly what he had come to do, and how he was going to do it. The beginning of the ministry. From that time, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." The same message as John, almost word for word, and yet something different. John had been preparing the way. Jesus was the way. John had been announcing that someone was coming. Jesus was announcing that he had arrived. The people of Galilee heard it, and something in them stirred. The way something stirs when you hear a truth you already knew but had almost forgotten. The wilderness behind him. The testing done. The ministry beginning. The kingdom near. Let the Galilee morning settle around you. The lake still. The fishing boats coming in. The world going about its ordinary business, not yet knowing that something was walking toward it. Something that had just spent 40 days deciding exactly who it was going to be. Chapter 5 is waiting, the calling, the fisherman on the shore of the lake when he found them, the tax collector at his table, the women who followed, whose names the Gospels record with careful attention, the unlikely group that would change everything, and the words he said to them that made them leave everything and follow. But only when you need it. The lake is still. The wilderness is behind him. The morning is enough. If you were building a team to change the world, who would you hire? Scholars, perhaps? Lawyers? Politicians? People with influence, with connections, with the kind of credentials that open doors in the places that matter. Here is who he hired. A fisherman, another fisherman, two more fishermen, a tax collector that everyone despised, and 7 others whose main qualification appears to have been that they said yes when he asked. No credentials, no connections, no experience of anything remotely relevant. These were the people who changed the world. Simon and Andrew, the first 2 brothers, fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, which was, as we have established, not really a sea, but let's not tell the fishermen that. Jesus saw them casting a net into the lake, and he said, simply, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." 5 words in the original language. Come, follow, me. And at once, the Gospel says, they left their nets and followed him. No negotiation, no asking for time to think. No, can you tell me more about what this involves? They left their nets and followed. Now, I want to pause here and think about what this actually means. These were not young men without responsibilities. Simon, we know, had a mother-in-law, which means he had a wife. He had a business, a fishing operation on the Sea of Galilee, which was, in the 1st century, a significant commercial enterprise. The fishing industry of the lake employed hundreds of people, supplied fish to towns across the region, generated real income for real families. And he left it, at once, because a man he had just met said, "Come, follow me." What was it about this man that made that possible? What did they see in that moment on the shore that made leaving everything feel not like loss, but like the most sensible thing they had ever done? The Gospel doesn't tell us. It just says, they went. James and John, a little further along the shore, also brothers, also fishermen, in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Their father Zebedee left in the boat with the hired men, watching, presumably, as his 2 sons walked away down the shore with this man from Nazareth. We don't know what Zebedee thought. The Gospel doesn't record his reaction, just the fact of it. 2 sons leaving, a father remaining, the boat still needing its nets prepared, the fish still needing to be caught, the ordinary world continuing as ordinary worlds do, even when extraordinary things are happening right in the middle of them. The 12. Over the days and weeks that followed, he called others, until the group had grown to 12. 12, the number of the tribes of Israel. Not accidental. Everything in this story was deliberate. The 12 representing a new Israel, a new community, gathered around a new covenant. Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, who had become famous for his doubting, which makes him one of the most relatable people in the entire Gospel. Matthew, the tax collector, whose calling we will spend some time on in a moment. James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, who had presumably before this believed that the kingdom of God would come through armed resistance, and Judas Iscariot, who would become the most complicated figure in the story. Matthew. Let's stay with this one, because the calling of Matthew is one of the most striking moments in the entire Gospel. Matthew was a tax collector, sitting at his tax booth, doing his work, the work that made him, in the eyes of his neighbours, a collaborator with the Roman occupation, the work that placed him, in the minds of religious authorities, among sinners. the work that meant that when people saw him coming, they crossed the street. And Jesus, walking past, saw him and said, "Follow me." And Matthew got up and followed him. Then Matthew gave a great feast at his house, and many tax collectors and sinners were eating with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees, seeing this, asked the disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus, hearing this, answered, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." One sentence that defined the entire ministry. Not the people who had it together, not the people who were already righteous, already observant, already doing everything right. The ones who knew they needed something. The ones who had been told by the world that they were beyond redemption. The tax collectors, the sinners, the people that polite society had already decided were not worth sitting down with. He sat down with them. He ate with them. He called one of them to be among his closest companions. The women, because the disciples were not only the 12. The Gospels, with careful attention, record the names of the women who followed Jesus throughout his ministry. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Chusa, the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others, the Gospel says, who supported the ministry out of their own resources. This detail is worth pausing on. In the first century, women travelling with a rabbi and his disciples was highly unusual. Women supporting a religious movement financially from their own resources was unusual. Women being named by a gospel writer as key participants in the story was unusual. And yet, there they were, named, present, supporting, following, part of the community from the beginning. Mary Magdalene. Of all the women, she is the most present in the Gospel accounts. We are told that Jesus had driven 7 demons from her, whatever that means precisely in the first century understanding. It speaks to someone who had been through something significant, something that had, in some way, held her and had been released. She followed from Galilee all the way to Jerusalem. She was present at the crucifixion. She was present at the burial. And she was the first person, the Gospels tell us, at the tomb on the morning that everything changed. We will come back to her in chapter 12, but I mention her now because she was there from the beginning, from the Galilee days, from the lake, from the ordinary mornings before the story became the story that everyone knows. Simon Peter. Let's spend a final moment with him, because Peter is the disciple who is most like us. Enthusiastic and then afraid, confident and then uncertain, saying the right thing and then, almost immediately, the wrong thing, promising with complete sincerity things he was not able to keep, failing and coming back, failing again and coming back again. He was the one who jumped out of the boat to walk to Jesus on the water, and then looked at the waves and started sinking. He was the one who declared, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," and was told, "This truth was revealed to you by my Father in heaven." And then, a few verses later, said something so misguided that Jesus said, "Get behind me." Within approximately 5 minutes. Peter, the rock on which the church would be built, who was also genuinely, wonderfully human. The community. By the time the 12 were gathered, and the women and the others who travelled with them, This was already an extraordinary group. A tax collector sitting beside a zealot, men who had been, before this, on opposite sides of the most urgent political question of their time. Should you cooperate with Rome or resist it? Matthew had cooperated. Simon the Zealot had resisted. And now they were eating together, travelling together, learning together from the same teacher. This was not a small thing. In a world as divided as first-century Judea, the community itself was already a statement, a living demonstration of what the kingdom of God might actually look like. People who had no business being in the same room, choosing to walk the same road, the road ahead. They were walking, mostly in Galilee, in the north, moving between villages, between towns, between synagogues, teaching, healing, eating with whoever invited them, sleeping wherever there was room. The logistics of 12 disciples, plus the women, plus others who joined, moving through a first-century landscape, were not small. People needed to eat. People needed to sleep. The resources that the women managed from their own means were, in this very practical sense, what made the ministry possible. The kingdom of God requiring, like all things, that someone sorted out, where everyone was going to sleep and what they were going to eat. The extraordinary always resting on the ordinary. He said one sentence on that hillside that has caused more argument, more debate, more discomfort than almost anything ever spoken in human history. Love your enemies. Not tolerate your enemies. Not avoid your enemies. Not wait patiently until God deals with your enemies. Love them. Pray for them. Do good to the people who are actively making your life difficult. He said this to people living under Roman occupation, to people who paid Roman taxes, to people who watched Roman soldiers march through their towns every single day. Love your enemies. 2,000 years later, we are still arguing about what it means, which probably means he was onto something. The Beatitudes, the opening of the Sermon on the Mount, 8 statements, each one beginning with the word blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. 8 statements, every single one upside down. Let's stay with this for a moment, because the world in which these words were spoken valued exactly the opposite of what he was describing. The Roman world valued strength, power, victory. The conquered were not blessed. They were conquered. The meek did not inherit the earth. The powerful took the earth, and the meek made the best of what was left. And into that world, on that hillside, to those people, many of whom were poor and mourning and meek, not by choice, but by circumstance. He said, "Blessed. You are blessed." Not, "You will be blessed someday if you work hard enough." Not, "You would be blessed if only you were different." Blessed. Now, as you are, in this, salt and light. After the Beatitudes, two images, two of the most quoted images in the entire Gospel. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Not, you could be, if you try hard enough. Not, some of you who are particularly impressive. You, the people on this hillside, the fishermen and the farmers and the tax collectors, and the women and the children who had been running around since everyone sat down. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Salt, in the first century, was not a seasoning. Not primarily. It was a preservative. The thing that kept food from going bad. The thing without which much of what was valuable would be lost. He was telling them that they, the ordinary people on the hillside, were what held the world together. That the world needed them, specifically them, to be what they were. The deeper law. Because the Sermon on the Mount was not just beautiful language, it was a radical reinterpretation of the law that the Jewish people had lived by for centuries. You have heard that it was said, "Do not murder." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. You have heard that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at another person with lustful intent has already, in their heart, committed adultery. The law said, "Don't do the thing." He said, the thing begins before the action, in the thought, in the intention, in the condition of the heart that produces the action. You cannot, he was saying, keep the law outwardly while the inside remains unchanged. The real work is on the inside. Love your enemies. This is, perhaps, the most demanding thing, he said, on that hillside. You have heard that it was said, "Love your neighbour and hate your enemy." But I tell you, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In an occupied country, spoken to people who lived under Roman rule, who paid Roman taxes, who watched Roman soldiers march through their towns every day. Love your enemies. Not tolerate them. Not avoid them. Not wait patiently until the Messiah comes and drives them out. Love them. Pray for them. This was, by any measure, extraordinary. The zealots in the crowd, who believed in armed resistance, would have found this very difficult. The Pharisees, who believed in careful separation from everything impure, would have found this challenging. Everyone found this challenging, which is probably why it is still being discussed 2,000 years later. The Lord's Prayer. Also on the hillside, or in a similar teaching in Luke, when the disciples asked, "Lord, teach us to pray." Our Father, in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The most prayed prayer in human history. Said every day by hundreds of millions of people in every language, in every country, in every circumstance imaginable. In cathedrals and foxholes and hospital rooms and prison cells. In the last moments of lives, in the first moments of recovery. The prayer that 2,000 years of human experience has found sufficient for almost everything. Do not worry. After the prayer, after the law, after the teaching on love, he turned to something that everyone in the crowd understood completely. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat, what you will drink, what you will wear. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Look at the flowers of the field, how they grow. They do not labour or spin, and yet I tell you that even Solomon, in all his glory, was not dressed like one of these. To a crowd of people who had real worries about real things. The tax collector coming next week. The harvest uncertain this year. The child who had been unwell. Real worries. And he was not dismissing them. He was pointing at something underneath the worry. The care that was already present in the world, if you could slow down long enough to see it. The two builders. The sermon ending with an image. Two men building houses. One building on rock. One building on sand. The rain comes. The floods rise. The winds blow. The house on rock stands. The house on sand falls. With, the Gospel says, a great crash. Simple. Almost too simple. The kind of image a craftsman uses. Someone who has watched what happens to foundations when the weather comes. And also the kind of image that stays with you. That comes back to you years later when you are building something and you realise you haven't thought enough about what you are building it on. The parables. Because the Sermon on the Mount was one extended teaching, but much of what Jesus taught came in a different form. The parable. A story. Short. Vivid. Seemingly simple, and then, the more you think about it, not simple at all. He told them throughout the ministry, in different places, to different crowds. Stories about seeds, about farmers, about wedding feasts, about lost sheep, about lost coins, about a father and two sons, and a moment of return that has made people weep for 2,000 years. The prodigal son, the most beloved parable. Let's spend a moment here. A father with two sons. The younger son asks for his share of the inheritance early, which, in the culture of the time, was roughly equivalent to saying, "I wish you were dead." The father gives it to him. The son goes to a distant country and wastes everything, and finds himself feeding pigs and hungry enough to want what the pigs were eating. And he comes to himself, the Gospel says. He comes to himself and turns toward home. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion and ran to him and embraced him. The father, running. In the 1st century, a grown man of standing did not run. Running was undignified, and this father saw his son a long way off, and ran. Dignity forgotten. The son not yet at the door, and the father already running toward him. Let the hillside settle into afternoon, the crowd slowly dispersing, carrying what they had heard back to their villages, back to their ordinary lives, where it would sit and work, and slowly, over days and weeks, change things. Chapter 7 is waiting. The healer. The miracles, what they were, what they meant to the people they happened to. The leper who was touched before he was healed. The blind man who received not just his sight, but his life back. And Lazarus in the tomb, 4 days, and the moment that changed everything about what people thought was possible. But only when you need it. The hillside is quiet. The crowd is walking home. The teaching still in the air. When was the last time someone touched you, just to let you know you were not untouchable? Not to heal you, not to fix anything, just to reach out and make contact and say, without words, I see you. You are not as far outside as the world has decided you are. This is what Jesus did before every healing, before every miracle. He saw the person first, not the condition, not the diagnosis, not the label that everyone else had already decided was the only important thing about them. The person first. A man with leprosy came to Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord," he said, "if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing. Not, can you?" He had no doubt, apparently, about the ability. The question was the willingness. Whether this man, like everyone else, would look at him and decide that the distance was easier. Whether the willingness extended to him. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him before saying a word, before the healing. The touch first. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Why does the touch matter? Because this man had not been touched, possibly, in years. The healing restored his skin. The touch restored his humanity. The message of the touch was not medical. It was, you are not untouchable. You are not beyond the reach of human contact. You are not as far outside as the world has decided you are. The healing changed his body. The touch changed something else, something deeper. The thing that years of being told you are unclean does to a person on the inside. He touched him first. And this, in the Gospel of Mark, is the first healing recorded. The very first thing he did when the ministry was underway. The touch before the miracle. The person before the condition. The paralyzed man and his friends. Because this healing involves one of the most vivid, most human, most quietly beautiful scenes in the entire Gospel. Jesus was in a house in Capernaum, teaching. The house was full, beyond full. So many people that there was no room left, even outside the door. And 4 men arrived, carrying a paralyzed friend on a mat. They could not get through the crowd. There was no way in. Through the door? Impossible. Through the crowd? Impossible. And so, they climbed to the roof and made an opening in the roof and lowered their friend through the hole on his mat into the room below, into the presence of the teacher. When Jesus saw their faith, the Gospel says, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Not, "Get up and walk." Not, "Be healed." Your sins are forgiven. And the teachers of the law, sitting there, began to think, this man is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? And Jesus, knowing what they were thinking, said, which is easier, to say to this man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralyzed man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. And the man got up, took his mat, and walked out, in full view of them all. The woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. This healing is different from all the others. Jesus was on his way through a crowd to heal someone else entirely. Jairus, a synagogue leader whose daughter was dying. Urgent, time mattering, the crowd pressing from every side. And a woman who had suffered from bleeding for 12 years, who had spent everything she had on physicians and had not gotten better but worse, reached out from within the crowd and touched the edge of his cloak. Immediately she felt that her suffering was over, and immediately Jesus, knowing that power had gone from him, stopped. In the middle of the urgent crowd, in the middle of the journey to the dying child, he stopped. Who touched me? He asked. His disciples, understandably, were baffled. Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you, and you ask, who touched me? But he looked around, waiting, and the woman, knowing what had happened, came forward, trembling, and fell at his feet, and told him the whole truth. Daughter, he said, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. daughter. He called her daughter. This woman, who had been suffering for 12 years, who had spent everything, who had touched his cloak from behind, hoping not to be noticed, was called daughter, named, seen, given peace, not just healing, but peace. The blind man, Bartimaeus, sitting by the road outside Jericho, begging. When he heard that Jesus of Nazareth was passing, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the crowd told him to be quiet, which, of course, made him shout louder, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped. "Call him," he said, and they called the blind man. "Cheer up," they said. "On your feet, he's calling you." And Bartimaeus, throwing his cloak aside, jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. "Rabbi, I want to see." "Go," said Jesus. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Lazarus. This is the one that changed everything. Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, was sick. The sisters sent word to Jesus, who was some distance away. "Lord, the one you love is sick." And Jesus, when he heard this, stayed where he was for 2 more days. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been in the tomb 4 days. 4 days, in the culture of the time, was significant. 3 days, there was still a possibility of life returning. 4 days, that possibility was gone. Martha came to meet him. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The grief in that sentence, and the trust still present underneath the grief, both at once. The particular anguish of someone who believed completely and is standing in the middle of the thing that belief apparently did not prevent. And then Mary, the other sister, came, and she fell at his feet. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." The same words from both sisters. The words they had probably been saying to each other for 4 days. If he had been here, if he had come sooner, if. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see," they said, and Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible. 2 words. Jesus wept. The man who 2 billion people believe was the Son of God stood at the tomb of his friend and wept. Not because he didn't know what was about to happen, not because he had lost hope, because grief is real, even when you know that it will not have the last word. Because the pain of the people around him moved him. Because love, expressed as grief, deserved to be honoured. By tears, by presence, by standing at the tomb and weeping alongside the people who were weeping. "Lazarus, come out." The stone rolled away, the command into the dark of the tomb, and Lazarus came out. His hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen, his face wrapped in a cloth, alive. "Take off the grave clothes," Jesus said, "and let him go." The crowd, some of them believed, and some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what had happened. And from that day on, the Pharisees and the chief priests began to plot to take his life. The raising of Lazarus, the miracle that made the authorities decide that something had to be done. The moment that turned the story toward Jerusalem. The leper touched. The paralyzed man walking. The woman called daughter, the blind man seeing, Lazarus alive, and the story turning. Let the road settle into evening, the healed ones going home, the crowd dispersing, carrying what they had seen, the authorities meeting, deciding what to do about this man from Nazareth. Chapter 8 is waiting, the turning, Jerusalem, the triumphal entry on a donkey, while the crowds threw palm branches and shouted, Hosanna. The temple and what he found inside it, and what he did that made the authorities even more determined. The last week beginning, and the tension building with every hour. But only when you need it. The road is quiet. The healed ones are home. The evening is enough. The most consequential week in human history, beginning with a man on a donkey, riding into the most important city in the Jewish world, and ending with a sealed tomb and a city that had no idea what it had just done. 7 days, from the cheering crowd throwing palm branches to the soldiers rolling the stone. From Hosanna to it is finished. From the most hopeful moment of the entire ministry to what looked like the end of everything. This is the week that the whole story had been moving toward. From the barn in Bethlehem, from the carpenter's workshop, from the lake in Galilee, everything pointing here, to this week, to this city, to these 7 days. Hosanna, the word worth understanding. It is, in Hebrew, a plea. Save us. Save now. The crowd shouting it as praise was also, perhaps, without quite knowing, shouting it as a desperate request. Save us from the Romans, from the occupation, from everything that this life in this province at this time required them to carry. They thought that was what was coming. They had watched him heal. They had watched him teach. They had heard about Lazarus. And now, here he was, riding into Jerusalem, while the crowd treated him like a king. They thought the kingdom was arriving in the form they had always imagined it. A king, a throne. The Romans finally driven out. They were about to discover that the kingdom was arriving in a form nobody had imagined. When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred. The Gospel says the whole city was stirred. A city of, at Passover time, perhaps 100,000 people. Normally 40 or 50,000. At Passover, doubled or more, as pilgrims arrived from across Judea, Galilee, the diaspora, and the whole city was stirred. Who is this? People were asking. This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. From Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Someone had asked at the very beginning. And here the answer, riding through the streets of Jerusalem while the city stirred around him. The temple. He went there the next day, and what he found inside moved him in a way that the Gospels record with careful attention. The outer courts of the temple, the court of the Gentiles, the area where anyone, Jew or non-Jew, could come to pray, to be near the most sacred space in the world, had been filled with merchants, selling animals for sacrifice, changing money, Roman coins, which bore the image of Caesar, could not be used in the temple. So money changers provided the temple currency at rates that were, by most accounts, not entirely fair. And Jesus made a whip of cords and drove them all out. The sheep, the cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those selling doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." This is one of the moments that surprises people who think of Jesus only as gentle and mild. He was, in this moment, absolutely clear. Not gentle, not mild, clear. The temple was for prayer, for all people. It had been turned into something else, and he restored it with force and with the particular righteous clarity of someone who had just looked at something wrong and could not simply walk past it. The authorities, the chief priests and the teachers of the law heard what he had done in the temple, and they began looking for a way to kill him. They were afraid of him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching. Afraid, not angry primarily. Afraid. The distinction matters. A man who had raised Lazarus from the dead, who had just walked into Jerusalem to the shouts of 100,000 people, who had cleared the temple with a whip made of cords, and whose teaching left crowds amazed, was not someone you could simply argue with. Something else was going to be required. The questions. The last week became a series of confrontations. The authorities sending delegations to trap him with questions. By what authority are you doing these things? The Pharisees and Herodians, together unlikely allies, united by a common problem, asked about taxes. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? A trap with two sides. Say yes, you are a collaborator. Say no, you are a rebel against Rome. He asked to see a coin. Whose image is on this? Caesar's, they said. Then give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. They were amazed, the Gospel says, and left him and went away. The trap walked out of so smoothly that there was nothing left to say. The widow's offering. In the middle of the confrontations, the traps, the building tension, a quiet moment. Jesus sat down opposite the temple treasury and watched people putting their offerings in. Many rich people throwing in large amounts. And then a poor widow came and put in 2 small coins worth only a fraction of a penny. Calling his disciples, he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." In the middle of the last week, with everything building toward its conclusion, he sat and watched a poor widow give everything she had, and called his disciples to pay attention. This, he said, is what it looks like. The Mount of Olives. That evening he sat on the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem. The disciples came to him privately. "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And he answered them at length. The passage that scholars have been debating for 2,000 years. He spoke of difficult times, of the temple that would not always stand, of the need for perseverance, of the importance of being ready for what was coming. And he told them parables about servants waiting for their master to return, about 10 bridesmaids, some with oil for their lamps, some without, about the servants given talents and what they did with them. The consistent message underneath all of it, be ready, be faithful, be awake. What is coming will come, and the question is whether, when it does, you will be found doing what you were given to do. 2 days before Passover, the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for a way to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. Not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. And then a solution came to them from an unexpected direction. One of the 12, Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you?" We will not spend long on why. The Gospel of John suggests greed. Other traditions suggest disillusionment, a Messiah who refused to be the warrior king that Judas had hoped for. The truth is that we don't fully know. What we know is that he went, that he asked, that they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. The palm branches on the road, the temple cleared, the widow and her 2 coins, the last week moving toward the last night. Let Jerusalem settle into night, the city full of Passover pilgrims sleeping, the temple, its lamps burning, the Mount of Olives dark against the stars, and a small group somewhere in the city finding a room for one last meal together. Chapter 9 is waiting, the Last Supper, the final meal that gave the world one of its most enduring rituals. The bread broken, the wine poured, the feet washed, and the announcement that one of them at the table was about to betray him, and Judas leaving into the night. But only when you need it. Jerusalem is quiet, the lamps are burning, the last night is beginning. Somewhere at the table tonight was the man who was going to betray him. He knew it. He knew exactly who it was. He sat down with him anyway. He washed his feet anyway. He broke bread and passed the cup with him at the table anyway. And when the moment came to identify him, he gave him the bread dipped in the dish, the gesture of honour, of favour, of the host to the guest he most wished to celebrate. Even at the Last Supper, the last act toward the man who was about to destroy everything was an act of dignity. The feet. Before the meal, something happened that the disciples did not see coming. Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer garment, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet. The washing of feet in the first century was the task of the lowest servant. The roads were dusty or muddy, depending on the season. The sandals provided minimal protection. Feet, at the end of a day's walking, needed washing. And it was the servant, the lowest servant, who did it. There was no servant in the upper room, and the disciples had not washed each other's feet. And so, their teacher took the towel and the basin and did what none of them had thought to do. He came to Peter. Of course, he came to Peter. "Lord," Peter said, "are you going to wash my feet? You do not realize now what I am doing," Jesus answered, "but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." "Unless I wash you," Jesus said, "you have no part with me." Then Peter, being Peter immediately reversed himself. "Not just my feet, Lord, but my hands and my head as well." "Whoever has had a bath," Jesus said, "needs only to wash their feet, and you are clean, though not every one of you." That last line, quiet, almost passing, "though not every one of you." He knew already what was coming. He knew who was at the table. And he washed Judas's feet too. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked, when he had finished and returned to his place. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. The servant is not greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." The last extended teaching before the cross was not about theology, not about the kingdom, not about what was coming. It was about a towel and a basin and the feet of 12 people who were going to need to remember this for the rest of their lives. The announcement, the meal beginning, and then, into the warmth of it, a statement that changed the atmosphere in the room immediately. "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." The disciples began to be sorrowful and to say to him, one after another, "Surely not I, Lord." One after another, every single one asking the same question, "Surely not I." Because, apparently, none of them were entirely certain that they were not capable of it, which is one of the most honest moments in the entire gospel. Not, "Surely not Judas, that man is suspicious." Surely not I. The question turned inward, each one examining what they knew about themselves. Judas, leaning toward him, asked, "Surely not I, Rabbi?" "You have said so," Jesus answered. The Gospel of John tells us more. The beloved disciple leaning close, asking who it was. Jesus answering quietly, "It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." And he dipped the bread and gave it to Judas. The giving of the bread in the culture of the time was an act of honour, of favour. The host giving the bread to the guest he most wished to honour. Even now, in this moment, the act was one of dignity extended to the one who was about to betray him. "What you are about to do, do quickly." And Judas went out, and it was night. 4 words in the Gospel of John, and it was night. The darkest 4 words in the chapter. Not just a description of the time of day, the darkness of a moment when someone chose what they chose, and went out into it. The door closing, the room quieter. 12, now 11. The bread. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and after giving thanks, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The bread and the wine of the Passover meal being given a new meaning, not replacing the old one, layering on top of it. The meal that remembered liberation from Egypt, now also the meal that remembered something else, something that hadn't happened yet, but was hours away. Do this in remembrance of me. 5 words that have been honoured every Sunday in every Christian church on every continent for 2,000 years. The meal that became the central ritual of the largest religion on earth. The Eucharist, communion, the Lord's Supper, called different things by different traditions, understood differently by different theologies, but recognised by all of them as the moment from which something essential began. An upper room, a broken piece of bread, a cup of wine. Do this in remembrance of me. The farewell discourse. After the bread, after the wine, he talked to them, at length. The Gospel of John devotes 4 chapters to what he said in that upper room after Judas had gone. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. I am going to prepare a place for you. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. The prayer. At the end of the discourse, he prayed, for them, and for everyone who would come after them. Father, the hour has come. He prayed for himself first, for what was coming, for the strength to do what was required. Then, for the 11. Holy Father, protect them. I am not asking you to take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. Sanctify them in the truth. And then the prayer widened. My prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe through their message. He prayed for us, or at least for everyone who would come after. In the upper room, before the arrest, before everything that followed, he prayed for the people who weren't there yet. When he had finished, they sang a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. They sang, before what was coming, they sang the Hallel, the traditional Passover hymns, Psalms 113 to 118, songs of praise and trust, and the declaration that God was faithful even in darkness. Even now, even tonight, they sang. And then they went out into the night, toward the garden, where the next part of the story was waiting. The bread broken, the wine poured, the prayer spoken, the hymn sung, and then into the night. Let the upper room settle into quiet, the lamps still burning, the table still holding what was left of the meal, the bread broken, the cup emptied, the room that held the most important meal in human history, now still. Chapter 10 is waiting. Gethsemane and the trial. The garden, where he asked if there was another way. The arrest, in the dark, with lanterns and torches, and the sound of soldiers. Peter, denying 3 times before the rooster crowed. Pilate, washing his hands, and the crowd, making the choice that the story has never fully recovered from, but only when you need it. The upper room is quiet. The lamps are burning. The bread is broken. Of all the ways to betray someone, Judas chose the most intimate one. Not a pointed finger, not a shouted name, not a description given to soldiers from a safe distance. A kiss. The greeting between friends, between teacher and student. The most tender gesture in the culture used as a signal to the soldiers in the dark, in the garden. That one. That is the one. And Jesus, receiving it, called him friend. In that moment, friend. The word that tells you everything about everything that came before it and everything that came after. Gethsemane. The name means oil press. A garden on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, where olive trees, some of which may be old enough to have been there that night, grew in the darkness. He had gone there with the 11 after the supper, after the hymn, after leaving the upper room. "Sit here," he said, "while I go and pray." And he took Peter and James and John, the 3 who had been with him on the mountain of Transfiguration, and went a little further. "My soul," he told them, "is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." And he went a little further still, and fell with his face to the ground, and prayed. The prayer. "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." 3 times he prayed this prayer, or something very close to it. 3 times he went back to find the disciples, and found them sleeping. The first time he came back and found Peter asleep. "Couldn't you," he said, "keep watch with me for 1 hour? The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Peter, who had promised earlier that evening that he would die with him if necessary, was asleep in the garden, while his teacher prayed alone in the dark. Not from lack of love, from exhaustion, from the weight of the night, from the very human, very real difficulty of staying awake when everything in you wants to close and not feel what is happening. The Gospel of Luke adds a detail that the other Gospels do not include. An angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. Whether understood literally or as the language of extreme distress, the image is undeniable. This was not a composed acceptance of what was coming. This was a human being in genuine anguish, facing something of incomprehensible weight, and choosing, in the middle of that anguish, to continue. "Not my will, but yours." The most courageous prayer, perhaps, ever prayed. The arrest. While he was still speaking, Judas arrived. A large crowd with him, sent from the chief priests and the elders, carrying swords and clubs, and lanterns and torches. The light of the lanterns flickering through the olive trees, the sound of the crowd moving through the garden, breaking the silence of the prayer irreversibly. Judas had given them a signal. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him. He approached Jesus. "Greetings, Rabbi," he said, and kissed him. The kiss, in the culture of the time, was a greeting between friends, between teacher and student, the most intimate, most trusting gesture of the culture, used as a signal to the soldiers, the most tender thing made into the mechanism of betrayal. "Do what you came for, friend." He called him friend. In this moment, friend. One of the most quietly heartbreaking words in the entire gospel. Not traitor, not betrayer, friend. And then Peter, who had been sleeping, was very much awake. He drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. His name, the Gospel of John tells us, was Malchus. "Put your sword away," Jesus said. "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" And he touched the servant's ear and healed him. The last miracle before the cross was healing the wound caused by one of his own disciples defending him. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. All of them. The ones who had left their nets. The ones who had walked with him for 3 years. The ones who had heard the Sermon on the Mount and the parables and the farewell discourse in the upper room. The ones who had just an hour ago said, "Surely not I." All of them deserted him and fled, not from cowardice alone, from the particular, overwhelming disorientation of watching everything you had built your life around for 3 years suddenly seemed to be falling apart. They ran into the darkness, into the olive trees, and Jesus was led away alone. Peter following at a distance. He had run, but he came back at a distance, cautious, but back, following to the courtyard of the high priest. And there, warming himself by a fire in the courtyard, a servant girl recognized him. "You also were with Jesus of Galilee," she said. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said, and moved away to the gateway, where another servant girl saw him and said to those standing there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again he denied it, with an oath. "I don't know the man." A little later, those standing nearby came to Peter. "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And Peter began to call down curses and swore to them, "I don't know the man." remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And Peter went outside and wept bitterly. Wept bitterly. The man who had promised to die with him if necessary. The rock on which the church would be built. Outside, in the dark, weeping, because he had done exactly what he had promised he would never do. We will come back to Peter. The story does not end here for him. The weeping is not the last thing, but tonight, in the courtyard, by the fire, he wept, and the night held him in it. The trial before the high priest, Caiaphas, first. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious council, assembled, looking for evidence against Jesus, so they could put him to death. They did not find consistent testimony. The Gospel says, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, the high priest stood up and asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," Jesus said. "And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "Why do we need any more witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. Pilate. Because the Sanhedrin could not carry out an execution under Roman law without Roman authority, they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. Pilate is a fascinating, deeply uncomfortable figure. He examined Jesus. He found no basis for a charge against him. He said so clearly. "I find no fault in this man." He tried to release him. It was the custom at Passover for the governor to release one prisoner chosen by the crowd. He offered them a choice: Jesus or Barabbas, a man who had been imprisoned for murder and insurrection. The crowd, stirred up by the chief priests, asked for Barabbas. "What shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" But they shouted louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." The washing of the hands, one of the most famous gestures in human history, the attempt to separate oneself from a decision one has nonetheless made. Pilate ordered the crucifixion, then washed his hands, and sent a man he had declared innocent to his death. The bureaucrat who knew what he was doing and did it anyway, because the crowd was louder than his conscience, and the career mattered more than the man standing before him. The garden behind him now. The prayer answered not as he asked. The disciples scattered. Peter weeping in the dark, and the road ahead toward the cross. Let the night give way to morning, the kind of morning that nobody wanted to come. The disciples scattered, hiding, not knowing what to do with what had happened. Peter somewhere in the dark, weeping, and the road from the praetorium toward a hill outside the city beginning. Chapter 11 is waiting, the crucifixion. I want to tell you, before we get there, that this chapter will be the quietest in the entire video. No hooks, no re-hooks, just the story, told as gently as honestly as I know how, with complete respect for what this moment means to those who love it, and with complete care for everyone listening. But only when you need it. The night is giving way. Peter is weeping. The road is beginning. OP1. When he died, something happened in the temple that nobody had touched. The curtain, the thick, heavy curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the Jewish world, from everything outside it, tore from top to bottom. Not from the bottom, as if a person had pulled it, from the top, down. The barrier between the human and the divine that had stood for centuries, torn at the moment of his last breath. The temple had no idea what it had just announced. Neither did the soldiers standing at the foot of the cross. One of them, looking up, said the thing that the whole chapter had been building toward. Surely this man was the Son of God. OP2. Every detail of this chapter is important, but there is one that I keep coming back to. One that I think contains more human weight than almost anything else in the entire gospel. His mother was there, standing near the cross, watching. The 14-year-old girl who had said yes to an angel in Nazareth 33 years before, who had wrapped him in cloths and laid him in a manger, who had searched for him for 3 days in Jerusalem when he was 12, who had followed every step of the ministry from Galilee to Jerusalem, was standing at the foot of the cross, watching her son die. And from the cross, even then, he made sure she would be taken care of. OP3. The last person to receive a promise from Jesus before he died was a criminal. Not a disciple, not a priest, not one of the women who had followed him from Galilee. A criminal being crucified beside him, who turned his head and said the simplest thing anyone says in the entire gospel. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Not, I deserve this. Not, I have earned anything. Just, remember me. And the answer came back immediately. Today, you will be with me in paradise. The last promise from the cross was not to the faithful, it was to the broken, which, if you have been paying attention, is exactly what you would expect from this man. The soldiers took him into the praetorium, the governor's headquarters, and the whole company gathered around him. They put a scarlet robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns and placed it on his head. They put a staff in his right hand, and they knelt before him, mocking him. "Hail, King of the Jews," they said, and they spat on him, and took the staff and struck him on the head again and again. I will not dwell here longer than necessary, but I will not pass over it either. This happened. This was part of the story. The man who had healed and taught and washed feet and prayed for his enemies was mocked and beaten by soldiers who were doing their job and saw nothing unusual in the doing of it. The walk. They led him away to crucify him. The Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, the path through Jerusalem, from the Praetorium to Golgotha, the place of the skull, the cross, carried or partly carried through the streets. A man named Simon from Cyrene was coming in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. Simon of Cyrene, a name recorded in the Gospels of a man who was simply coming in from the country that morning, who had no idea when he woke what the day would ask of him, who was, by every account, compelled, not a volunteer, a man whose ordinary morning was interrupted by soldiers who needed someone to carry a cross. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children." Even now, on the walk, he was thinking of others, the women weeping for him, and he was concerned for them, for what was coming, for their city, for the years ahead that he could see and they could not. Golgotha, the place of the skull, a hill outside the city walls where crucifixions took place, public, visible from the road, as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging Roman authority. It was the 3rd hour, the Gospel of Mark says, 9 in the morning. They crucified him. I will tell you, simply, what the Gospels record, and let the weight of it rest where it rests. They crucified him, and divided his garments, casting lots for who would get what. A sign was placed above his head, written by Pilate himself, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, Greek, so that everyone passing could read it. 2 other men were crucified with him, one on his right, one on his left. And those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads. "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." The chief priests, the teachers of the law, the elders also mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let him come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And then one of the criminals crucified with him joined in the mocking. But the other rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what we deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. The last person to receive a promise from the cross was a criminal who asked simply to be remembered, not to be made righteous, not to have earned it, just remember me. And the answer, today you will be with me in paradise. Today, not someday, not if you work hard enough, not if you deserve it. Today. The women, near the cross, standing, watching. The disciples, scattered. But the women were there. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of Zebedee's sons, and, in the Gospel of John, his mother, Mary. His mother was there, standing near the cross, watching. The 14-year-old girl who had said yes to the angel in Nazareth 33 years before was standing at the foot of the cross, watching her son die. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son," and to the disciple, "Here is your mother." Even from the cross, making sure that his mother would be cared for. Even here, the last thoughts of someone else. The 7 words from the cross. There were 7 things he said from the cross. 7. Each one worth everything. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Today, you will be with me in paradise. Woman, here is your son. My God, why have you forsaken me? I am thirsty. It is finished. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. 7 things from the cross. The first, a prayer for the people crucifying him. The last, a trust given completely. And the one in the middle, perhaps the hardest to understand. My God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why have you forsaken me? The opening words of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in desolation and ends in trust. Whether he was quoting the psalm or crying out from the depths of a genuine experience of abandonment, or both, this moment is the most human, the most raw, the most honest thing in the story. The question that human beings have been asking in moments of extremity since the beginning. Why? Where are you? Have you left me? There is no easy answer to this moment in the theology of the Church. There are many answers, offered by many traditions, but the moment itself is allowed to stand in the Gospel unresolved. The question asked from the cross into the sky over Jerusalem, and the sky at that moment going dark. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over all the land. 3 hours of darkness, from noon to 3 in the afternoon. The middle of the day going dark. The Gospels recording it without explanation, simply that it happened, that the land went dark while this was occurring on the hill outside the city. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" After this, knowing that everything had now been completed, Jesus said, "I am thirsty." A jar of wine vinegar was there. Someone soaked a sponge in it and held it to his lips. When he had received the drink, Jesus said, "It is finished." Tetelestai, the Greek word. It is finished. Not, I am finished. Not, it is over. It is finished, as in, it is completed, accomplished, done in the way that something is done when it has been fully and perfectly brought to its conclusion. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split. The curtain of the temple, the thick curtain that separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space, from the rest of the temple, torn from top to bottom. Not from bottom to top, as if a person had pulled it, from top to bottom. When the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man was the Son of God." The women were still there, watching from a distance. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and Salome, and others who had followed him from Galilee, who had been there for the ordinary days, on the lake, in the towns, on the roads, and were there now for this. Still there, still watching, still present when almost everyone else had gone. The burial. A man named Joseph from Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, who had not consented to what had been decided, went to Pilate and asked for the body. He wrapped the body in a clean linen cloth and placed it in his own new tomb, cut out of rock. He rolled a big stone in front of the entrance to the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were sitting there opposite the tomb, watching. Even now, after everything, still there. It is finished. The stone is rolled. The women are watching. The city is quiet. And tomorrow is Saturday. Let the evening come, the Sabbath beginning, as it always began, at sundown across Jerusalem. The city going quiet. The disciples scattered, hiding, not knowing what to do with what had happened. The women preparing spices and perfumes for the body, because the Sabbath law did not permit them to go to the tomb until it was over. And so they waited. Chapter 12 is the last one. The long sleep, the silence of Saturday, the morning that nobody was expecting, and the stone that was not where they had left it, but only when you need it. The evening is here. The stone is rolled. The Sabbath is beginning. Nobody was expecting Sunday. This is the part of the resurrection story that people miss. The disciples were not waiting behind their locked doors in excited anticipation. They were not counting down the hours until the third day. They were grieving. They were afraid. They were trying to work out what to do with the rest of their lives now that everything had ended in exactly the way they had feared. The Messiah was supposed to drive out the Romans. Instead, the Romans had driven him into a tomb with a stone in front of it and a seal on the stone and soldiers guarding it. Nobody on Saturday night was expecting what Sunday morning was about to bring. Which means what happened was not wishful thinking. It was a complete, total surprise. Nobody was expecting Sunday. This is the part that people always forget. The disciples were not waiting behind their locked doors in excited anticipation of what was about to happen. They were grieving. They were afraid. They were trying to work out what to do now with the rest of their lives, now that everything had ended in exactly the way they had feared it might. The Messiah, they had believed, was going to drive out the Romans, was going to establish the kingdom, was going to sit on the throne of David, had been crucified by the Romans, and was in a tomb with a stone in front of it, and a Roman seal on the stone, and Roman soldiers guarding it. This was not how the story was supposed to go. Nobody was expecting Sunday. The women. Early, on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. The Gospel of Mark tells us that she was joined by Mary, the mother of James, and by Salome. They had bought spices so that they might go and anoint the body. They were on their way before the sun had fully risen, while the city was still asleep, walking in the pre-dawn dark toward the garden, toward the tomb, toward the last act of love they could offer. And they were asking among themselves as they walked, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? A practical question, a very human question. The stone was large, the Gospel says, and they were women, alone, before sunrise, walking toward a tomb with spices and no plan for the stone, going anyway. When they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very large. The stone was not where they had left it, not where they had watched it rolled into place 2 days before. Rolled away, already, before they arrived, before they had worked out how they were going to manage it. The obstacle they had been worrying about on the walk was simply gone. As it so often is, the thing you fear most on the way has already been dealt with before you get there. The women, who had gone anyway, found that going anyway was exactly right. They entered the tomb, and they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. And they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. He is not here." 4 words. The 4 most world-changing words ever spoken in a garden at dawn. He is not here. The tomb, that was supposed to be the end, was empty. "But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." And Peter, named specifically, tell the disciples and Peter, the man who had denied 3 times, who had wept bitterly, who was somewhere in Jerusalem, carrying the weight of what he had done, was named specifically in the first message from the empty tomb. Not left out, not written off, named, included, as if the message knew exactly who most needed to hear it. Mary Magdalene and the resurrection. The Gospel of John tells her story separately and more fully. She stood outside the tomb, weeping. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been. "Why are you crying?" they asked her. "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize that it was Jesus. He asked her, "Why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary," 1 word, her name. And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," teacher. 1 word, calling her name, and she knew. Not from argument, not from evidence, not from a theological proof or a philosophical demonstration. From her name, spoken by the voice that knew how to say it. The Good Shepherd, he had said, calls his own sheep by name, and they recognize his voice. Mary recognized his voice. "Go, instead, to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." My brothers, not my disciples. My brothers, the 11 who had scattered, who had denied, who had fled in the garden, were called brothers. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." She was the first person in all of human history to say those words in that way. "I have seen the Lord." The first witness to the resurrection was a woman who had wept at the tomb until she heard her name. The appearances. Over the next 40 days, he appeared to many people. To the 11 in the locked room on the evening of the resurrection, he appeared and showed them his hands and his side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. To Thomas, who had not been there, and who said, "Unless I see the nail marks, I will not believe," he appeared a week later and said, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." "My Lord and my God," Thomas said. The man who doubted, becoming the one who said what perhaps all of them were feeling. "My Lord and my God." And Peter. We promised we would come back to Peter. The Gospel of John tells it with extraordinary care. By the Sea of Galilee, the lake where it had all begun, Peter and 6 other disciples had gone fishing. All night they caught nothing. At dawn, a figure on the shore called to them, "Friends, have you any fish?" "No," they answered. "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." They threw the net and were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. The beloved disciple said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Peter, hearing it was the Lord, wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. On the shore, a fire of coals, with fish and bread. "Come and have breakfast," Jesus said. "Come and have breakfast." The most ordinary, most human, most tender invitation in the entire Gospel. After the cross, after the tomb, after the resurrection, after everything that had happened in the last week and the last 3 years, come and have breakfast. The fire, the fish, the bread, the disciples and their Lord eating together on the shore of the lake where it had all begun. And then, 3 times, Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" 3 times, the number of the denials, not coincidental. 3 questions, meeting 3 denials, healing what the courtyard by the fire had broken. "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." 3 times. 3 times the yes given. 3 times the restoration offered. "Feed my sheep," Jesus said. After each answer, "Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep." The man who had denied 3 times was given 3 times the task of caring for the people who would come after. The failure not erased, but redeemed, used, made into something that the success could never have been. The Ascension, 40 days after the resurrection, on a hillside outside Jerusalem, he gathered the disciples for the last time. "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." The last words, a commission and a promise. I am with you always. Not I was with you. Not I will remember you. I am with you always. Present tense, ongoing, to the very end of the age. After he had said this, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. And they stood there, looking intently up into the sky as he was going. "Men of Galilee," said 2 figures in white suddenly beside them, "why do you stand here, looking into the sky? Why are you looking up?" There is the gentlest, most human, most practical question in the entire story. Why are you standing there, looking up? There is work to do. There are people to feed. There are sheep to tend. There is a world waiting. What happened next? Because the story did not end on the hillside. 11 men and a group of women who had seen everything went back to Jerusalem and waited, as they had been told to wait, for the Holy Spirit that had been promised. And on the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover, in the same city where everything had seemed to end, it began. Peter, who had wept in the courtyard, stood up in front of a crowd of thousands and spoke. The man who had said, "I do not know the man," 3 times by a fire in the dark, stood up in the light and told everyone exactly who the man was. 2,000 years from that hillside in Galilee, from that upper room, from that garden, from that empty tomb. 2,000 years. The story told in every language on earth. The bread broken every Sunday, in every country, on every continent, in every circumstance imaginable. The name spoken by 2 billion people as the most important word in their lives, and by another billion as the name of a great prophet. and by countless others, as the name of the most extraordinary human being who ever lived. All of it, from a barn in Bethlehem, from a carpenter's workshop in Nazareth, from a lake in Galilee, from a hillside where the poor and the mourning and the meek were told they were blessed. And now, wherever this found you, whatever brought you here tonight, whatever you believe, or are not sure you believe, or are trying to believe, or have decided you don't believe, you stayed. You followed the story from Bethlehem to Galilee, to Jerusalem, to the garden, to the cross, to the tomb, to the shore of the lake, where a man made breakfast for his friends after everything. You stayed. The stone has been rolled away. The morning has come. The question that the story has always asked is the same question it is asking right now, in this moment, wherever you are. What do you think of the man? You don't have to answer tonight. You can just rest. Let the question sit with you gently while you sleep. The tomb is empty. The stone is rolled. The fire is on the shore. The breakfast is ready. And the voice that called Mary by name knows yours too. The fire is on the shore. The morning has come. The story that has been told for 2,000 years has been told one more time for you tonight. I don't know what tonight was for you. Whether you came as someone who loves this story deeply and has loved it your whole life, or as someone who is not sure what they think about any of it, or as someone who just needed somewhere quiet to go and ended up here. All of you are welcome. All of you stayed, and that means something. If this helped, subscribe, because there are more nights coming, more stories, more of this. The story of Adam and Eve, next. How it all began. The garden, before this one. The first yes, and the first no, and what happened because of both. And if someone you know needs a night like this, send it to them. That is, perhaps, the most human thing you can do. Give someone a story when they need one. Good night. From Galilee, from the lake, from the fire on the shore. Good night.